Lightning flashed as Ida looked out of the lighthouse's old window. She watched the waves smash violently against the jagged rocks. The house stood on the edge of a cliff that fell vertically into the angry ocean below. She tended to the lighthouse alone. She cherished the solitude. She could feel the warmth of the beacon behind her. The mirrors that reflected the light of the whale oil candle radiated the heat of the flame. She wiped sweat from her brow with her white apron as she looked across the cruel sea. She strained her eyes, trying to see anything in the darkness. The light from the beacon was powerful, but its job was to indicate danger, not act as a spotlight for Ida's midnight vigils. She looked out of the old glass window a while longer, hoping she would see nothing. Her mind was filled with images of splintered timber, of men struggling against the brutal waves before being ground against the rocks. She closed her eyes and forced the memories away. She checked the candle before descending the spiral stairs. Thunder shook the house as she walked in the dark. The oil lamp she carried cast a warm glow against the whitewashed stone walls. She stepped into the main room at the bottom of the stairs and placed the lamp next to her bed. Lightning flashed and thunder boomed as she put the lamp out and fell asleep. The storm had calmed by the time Ida woke, but the sound of rain echoed off the roof. She got dressed and climbed the stairs again. She wound the clockworks that rotated the mirrors and changed the candle. She couldn't see much of anything out of the windows. The storm had given way to thick fog. She thought of the sailors navigating this thick gloom. She thought of them standing watch as their nerves stretched to their breaking point, while they wondered if their ship would be torn apart by mist-shrouded dangers. She walked back down to the room and prepared her breakfast. She sat at the wooden table and ate in silence, with the sound of rain still drumming on the roof. She lifted the wood spoon from the porridge and watched as the white sludge fell slowly back into the bowl. It was the same thing she ate every day. To be honest, she didn't mind. The routine of it all was good. The sound of someone banging heavily on the door broke through the calm. She stood and walked to the door. "Who's there?" She was not used to hearing her own voice.
"Please, we need help."
A middle-aged man's voice cut through the rain.
"My daughter's hurt."
Ida opened the door when she heard this. A man wearing the clothes of a preacher stood in the rain carrying a girl in his arms. Her leg was wrapped in a makeshift splint. "Bring her in," Ida said, as she ushered them to the sofa that sat against the wall. The man lowered the girl down gently. She winced as she settled into the cushions. Ida pulled 2 chairs near the sofa. Her and the preacher sat. "Thank you." The man took his hat off and wiped his face, the gesture useless against the rain that soaked him. "Our horse broke from our carriage during the storm. We sheltered as best we could for the night and walked here in the morning." He turned his eyes to the girl. "She slipped and broke her leg. Damn me for not paying closer attention." He reached out to hold the girl's hand. "Well, you are here now." Ida meant well, but she wasn't used to conversation. "Yes," the man said. "Would you like something warm?" "That would be a blessing. Thank you." Ida checked the fire in the stove. She added a few small logs and put the kettle on. "So, what brings you out here?" she said, as she leaned back against the counter. "We are heading south to spread the word." "You didn't make it far." The kettle whistled and Ida poured mugs of tea. She brought one to the preacher. "No, we did not," he said bluntly. A sound startled them. The noise was like a freight train ripping past. They both stood and went to the window to look out over the sea. The fog had thinned, but still hung over everything. A red streak burned like fire through the sky. The streak met the water, and an explosion bigger than anything either of them had ever seen burst into the air.
What in God's name?
The man said. Ida was already running out the door while he stood in awe. She ran down the hill at the side of the lighthouse. There was a slim path. It was the only way to get to the water below. Her heart was pounding, and her breath was heavy as she pushed the rowboat into the water. She gripped the oars and pulled herself towards the explosion. The fog had mercifully thinned, and she could see smoke rising in the distance as she looked over her shoulder. She continued to pull, timing her strokes to cut through the breakers that hammered the shore. Memories of bodies torn against rock came to her mind, the helpless screams of men drowning as their bodies were torn apart. All she recovered then were severed limbs and destroyed corpses. She would not let that happen now. She pulled harder, the boat moving swiftly toward the rising smoke. She lifted the oars as the boat drifted into the smoke. Movement broke the still water. She saw something struggling. She rowed to the commotion and saw a person flailing weakly, desperately trying to stay afloat. She reached into the water and pulled them into the boat. She was surprised at the ease of this, at how light the person was. They collapsed into the bottom of the boat, and Ida stared. They were the size of the young man who would sometimes come to the lighthouse to help chop wood. They wore silver clothes that reminded her of the nights her father used to tell her stories about when she couldn't fall asleep. Their face was covered by a helmet. It looked to be made of glass, but Ida could not see inside. She was amazed, but did not waste time as she rowed back to the house. The person had stopped moving, and Ida rowed hard. She let the momentum of the boat carry them up onto the shore. She picked the person up. Again, she was puzzled by how light they were, but did not dwell on the thought as she carried them up the hill and to the house. The preacher saw them coming. He had been watching as Ida rowed out to sea. He opened the door and stared at the pair as they stepped inside. Ida dropped the still body onto the ground in front of the sofa. The heels of the preacher's buckled shoes clicked against the wooden floor as he walked toward them. The girl leaned up on one elbow. Her pale face winced with the effort. Ida stood. They all looked down at the body that lay on the floor. It was about the same size as the girl. The silver clothing it wore covered it entirely, and it wore thick boots on its feet. The black glass orb that covered its face was still impenetrable, even in the clear light of the house.
Where did they come from?
The preacher's voice broke the silence. Ida did not respond, as she lit a lamp and held it to the black glass. Still, she could not see within. Her reflection stared back at her as it walked in the lamplight.
Woman, answer me!
The preacher tried to sound firm, but his voice dripped with fear. Ida looked him in the eyes. He shrunk from her gaze.
You are in my house, preacher.
Yes, of course. Sorry, I only...
He sounded meek now as he held his dripping hat in his pruny fingers.
Help me get this off.
Ida bent down next to the person's head. Truth be told, she didn't care where they came from. She only cared that they should live. The preacher joined her, and they felt around the stranger's neck. Ida's hand fell onto a clasp, and she flipped it open. A hiss came from the helmet as it detached from the rest of the silver suit. They looked at each other and then removed the helmet.
My God!
The preacher jumped to his feet. He clutched a Bible he had fetched from inside his jacket. His eyes widened in terror as he backed away. His mouth was gaping when his back hit the wall.
A demon! By God, it's a demon!
Ida had risen to her feet as well. She stood with her hands on her hips. She looked calm, but her stoic expression masked her nerves. The thing's head was shaped like a teardrop. The massive forehead tapered to a small, pointed chin. 2 small slits inlaid the face. She could only guess that these were nostrils. Its eyes were massive. They were bulbous ovals that covered more than half its face. They were closed, but the translucent membrane that acted as an eyelid left the deep black eyes just barely visible.
Why did you bring this abomination onto us?
The preacher was hysterical. Ida ignored him. She noticed the thing's nostrils moving, just barely. It was alive.
Calm down,
Ida shouted.
help me move him.
The preacher did not budge. Girl had been silent as she watched in awe. She moved then, straining to sit up. She used her hands to lower her splintered leg off the sofa.
Move him here.
She said. Ida nodded and lifted the thing onto the sofa.
Gretchen, do not let that thing near you!
The preacher shouted at his daughter, but still made no move. The girl helped Ida lay the creature on the sofa, helping as best she could in her current state. The preacher finally moved, walking to the girl and grabbing her arm as if to move her.
Father, please.
The girl said as she pulled her arm free.
Insolent little...
The preacher raised his hands to the girl but stopped when he saw that Ida had produced a pistol and was pointing it at his chest.
Sit down,
she said. He sat. He held his hands up, but his skin was flush. Anger burned across his face as he looked from the girl to the creature and to Ida.
This is your fault,
he said, staring at Ida.
Can I put this away?
She still held the gun at his chest. The preacher breathed deeply, his chest rising and falling slowly. He waved his hand dismissively. Ida watched him for a moment and then lowered her pistol, putting it in the belt of her apron. She sat in the chair opposite the preacher. Silence filled the room as the trio stared at the stranger. Ida tried to think logically, but what logic was there in what was in front of her? Perhaps the preacher was right. What had she brought into her house?
We'll restrain it.
She broke the silence.
Finally, some sense,
the preacher said as he stood. They lifted the creature into the chair Ida had been sitting in, and the preacher held it steady as she retrieved a length of hemp rope from the closet. They tied the creature to the chair, Ida's knot securing it firmly. Its nostrils still flared rhythmically, but it did not move.
We are leaving,
the preacher said, as he tried to lift the girl from the sofa. She winced loudly, and he set her back down.
Where?
Ida asked.
The nearest town is miles away.
The preacher sat back down and rubbed his face in frustration.
A supply train comes in 2 days. They can take you.
The preacher looked like he was searching for ways to protest the idea.
Very well,
he finally said.
But what do we do with that thing?
Poison dripped from his words. It was a good question, and Ida was wondering the same.
First, we see if it dies.
She lied. She had no intention of letting the stranger die if she could help it.
Why don't you help the foul thing die then and be done with it?
He pointed to the pistol in her belt.
I am not a murderer.
Ha! Murder? It is not murder to destroy this unholy beast.
The red had returned to the preacher's face as his anger rose, gesticulating like he was giving one of his sermons.
Every minute that thing lives is an affront to God. Shoot it now. Burn the body. Throw it over the wretched cliffs.
He was wild with rage now. The tendons in his neck were rigid and pulsed with the heavy beating of his boiling heart. He pointed at the creature, prodding the air to punctuate his words. Then, the thing's eyes opened. The red left the preacher's face as he saw the thing in the chair move its head, turning to look directly at him. He was struck silent as the creature's black eyes met his. His gaping mouth moved, but he could form no words. He stumbled backwards. A look of terror spread across his pale face. He tripped, and his head bounced off the floor as he fell. A sickening thud rang out, and it was followed by silence as he was knocked unconscious.
Father!
The girl yelled. She tried to stand, but the pain dropped her back to the sofa. Ida made sure the preacher was breathing and placed a pillow under his head. Her heart raced when she looked back at the creature. Its eyes were closed again, and its head rested on its chest. The day passed. Ida tended the light while the girl rested on the sofa. She read books that Ida gave her while her father slept on the floor. He woke a few times, but only groaned before falling asleep once more. The night came, and Ida made dinner for her and the girl. They ate, and the still thing in the chair did not move. Its eyes did not open. The rhythmic pulse of its facial slits continued as the waves battered the cliffs outside the house. Ida sat as the girl fell asleep. She stared at the creature as it sat slumped and bound. She stood and climbed the circling stairs up to the light to make her final checks. She tended the candle and wound the clockworks. She looked out the window and over at the sea. The moon was bright, and the fog was gone. The black water stretched endlessly. The stars were clear, and she remembered looking at them with her father. They would look deeply at the night sky. They would wonder what laid in its endless expanses.
Where do you think they go, Ida?
Her father would say to her, smiling as they looked at the white dotted carpet of black that stretched to the horizon. Ida smiled at the memories before she walked back down the stairs, leaving the bright beacon of the light streaming across the abyss. She checked the restraints on the chair before she climbed into bed. The familiar sound of the crashing waves lulled her to sleep as usual.
Leader.
The sound of her name woke her. She could hear the waves crashing, and she rolled over. Surely she was imagining things.
Leader.
She was awake now. Surely she had heard it that time, or felt it. It was like she was thinking her name to herself. She sat up and looked across the room. Her breath stopped as she met eyes with the thing in the chair. It was awake now, and its black eyes stared at her. It was calling her. She knew that somehow. She got out of bed and walked slowly to the thing, sitting in the empty chair across from it. Her breath returned, and she did not know why she was not afraid.
What are you?
She said to the creature. No, she realized she was not speaking out loud, but somehow knew the thing understood her. She saw its head tilt slightly as she looked into its huge black eyes. Then, her mind was torn. She felt herself break from reality as the room warped, and suddenly she was without a body, accelerating with unbelievable speed through endless black. She was moving between stars. The darkest bent, her mind reeled. She was no longer seeing anything. The thing was trying to tell her something. Her mind screamed as she tried to understand as infinity tore into her consciousness. She could feel herself gazing over the edge, but it was far beyond her comprehension. She could feel something now. She could feel fear, but it was not hers. She felt the terror the creature felt as it ripped her mind. Was it running? What was it running from?
What is coming?
She tried to ask. A sound shot her back to herself. A bright flash blinked as she realized she was again sitting in the chair.
An abomination!
The preacher had woken and was pointing a pistol at the creature. Ida could smell burnt gunpowder as she saw smoke rising from the pistol's barrel.
What have you done?
She ran to the stranger. The creature's eyes were still open, but the dark, obsidian pools of its eyes had begun to fade to grey. She could see a hole in its chest. Something orange leaked out as she pressed her hand against it. She hoped it would help, but somehow knew it wouldn't. She held her hand over the wound as she watched the creature's eyes fade. Its nostrils stopped their rhythm, and she could feel its body relax, slumping against the rope that still bound it to the chair. The girl had awoken and was screaming as she watched Ida turn with wild eyes to her father.
It was the devil,
he said. His eyes were wide, and he still held the pistol pointed at the dead thing's chest.
My mind, I saw...
He was incomprehensible. He looked at the dead creature as he tried to speak. Ida had picked up the fork that still sat next to her dinner plate and held it over her head as she charged the preacher. She did not know where the rage came from, but it filled her as she fell on the man. The points of the fork ricocheted off the skull as she stabbed at his head. Blood was pouring from his wounds as he tried to get away, the fork piercing his skin repeatedly, the thick bone turning it away each time it stabbed through flesh. The girl was screaming frantically as she watched Ida butcher her father's face. Fork fell deeply into the preacher's cheek, sticking in the muscle as his screams joined his daughter's. Ida stood over him. Her chest heaved with her heavy breath as she looked down at the bloody mess that used to be the preacher's head. Her eyes were wide as she watched him raise his hands in a pathetic attempt for mercy. The rage started to leave her, and terror seeped into place behind it. Her breath slowed as her blood cooled. She fell to her knees next to the bleeding man. He flinched as she reached out to him.
Oh, God,
she said, as her hands searched for where to start giving aid. His breath wheezed through the blood that filled his mouth. The girl had stopped screaming. She stared in shock, her mouth wide in silence as she watched her father moan in agony. The creature sat motionless in the chair, its dead, grey eyes seeing nothing. The preacher groaned. The noise was wet with blood as he clawed his way across the floor, trying to move away from Ida. She did not follow. She kneeled and watched him struggle. She wiped her wet, red palms on her apron. The sound of scraping mixed with guttural moans as the fork that was still lodged in the preacher's face dragged across the floor. A quiet, deep noise began to fill the air. At first, Ida could only feel it, but as it grew louder, she raised her hands to her ears. The lighthouse began to shake, a slow rumble. The lamps clattered and threw their red glow around the room. The dishes rattled on the table. Ida stood and went to the window, reaching out to steady herself as she moved. She squinted into the moonlight. The sound was coming from somewhere out there. The vibrations intensified. She held herself steady, but did not leave the window. Dishes smashed to the floor. Still, Ida looked across the water. There, she saw something. The beacon of the lighthouse scanned over the ocean, and it passed by something. Something gigantic. It passed again, and Ida glimpsed the massive shape emerging from the nighttime clouds. A black disc that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Still it came, slowly moving over the black abyss while the house shook. She could hear the girl screaming again, but she did not turn to look. Her eyes were fixed on the thing emerging from the sky, and then it stopped. The house stopped shaking. The girl still screamed while her father wheezed on the floor. The creature still sat dead in the chair. Somehow Ida knew this thing in the sky had followed the creature. It could no longer feel the fear, but she could. Ida pulled the girl off the sofa, dragging her to the closet as she screamed in pain. Her broken leg bounced off the floor as they moved. Ida left the preacher wallowing in his own blood. His terrible moans were already fading. She looked at the creature as they passed. She felt sorrow as she left it there, dead and bound. She slammed the doors of the closet, holding a hand over the girl's mouth and holding a finger to her own. She could feel the girl's breath on her palm as her hand muffled the screams. Ida looked at the girl, holding her gaze until the screaming stopped. A sliver of light split the two women. The doors of the closet did not meet flush, and a small gap let the warm light of the room in. Ida followed the light and looked out of the crack between the doors. She could see the door to the house. She could not see the preacher, but she could hear his quiet groans. She flinched as the door was smashed in. Splinters crashed against the closet as she felt her mouth drying with fear. The door was open to the night now, and it was impossible to see into the inky darkness. A fast clicking noise seeped into the house. It was like the sound of dolphins mixed with the snapping of a gigantic insect's jaws. The clicking slowed, and Ida saw the blackness of the night stretch into the room. She felt her heart race as she realized she recognized the black form that floated along the wall as it crept into the house. A tentacle, like the limbs of the octopuses that her father would fish out of the ocean. Another terrible black tentacle entered the house, and then another, and another. Ida could not keep track of the dreadful tendrils as they seeped along every surface. The tentacles pulsed, waves traveling down their length and out of the door. Then, the body emerged, pulled inside by the anchored tendrils. Ida could see the massive beak that sat in the center of the black flesh. She could see it crack together, the source of the terrible clicking sound that ripped through the air. It held itself aloft by the black tentacles, floating side to side as its jaw snapped. It stopped. Through the slit in the doors, Ida could see it turn to the sound of the preacher's struggle. She could see the black tentacles move again, sliding along the walls like worms. The mucus-covered flesh glistened grotesquely in the light. The tentacles continued to move, and the preacher came into view through the slit in the doors. He was held aloft by one horrendous black tendril, wrapped around him like a snake. He was barely conscious, and Ida could see bubbles of blood forming and bursting on his lips as he breathed shallow breaths. The tentacle raised him towards its mouth. The sound was louder than any before, and it made Ida wince. She held her hand to her mouth to keep herself silent, and realized she still held her other hand over the girl's mouth. She kept it there. The preacher's head now hung limp. The tentacle that was wrapped around him slithered tighter, and the horrible sound of cracking bone filled the air as the creature's eyes burst from his skull. The creature was vibrating now. The mucus that covered its body fell in thick droplets to the floor as it chittered loudly and squeezed the preacher tighter, crushing him utterly. Somehow, Ida knew that it was frustrated. It released the preacher. His body fell to the floor with a sickening thud. Ida squeezed the hand over her mouth tighter as she shut her eyes. The clicking picked up speed again, and Ida opened her eyes. She could see the body moving again now, slowly shifting around the room as the beak clicked violently. It stopped again. It had found the thing in the chair. Ida knew that. The fear returned now. Not her own, but the fear that had been shared with her. Her dry throat struggled to swallow as her heart pounded. The clicking slowed and the tentacles moved again. The limp form of the thing in the chair came into view through the crack in the doors. The tip of one of the tendrils was wrapped around the silver-dressed stranger's boot-covered foot. It had been freed from the chair. Its body hung limply in front of the black form of the massive intruder. The terrible creature seemed to look at the small body, the click still soft, but speeding into a rapid pulse as the tendril shifted the body in the air. The clicking stopped, and a heavy silence fell. The intruder burst from the house suddenly, flowing out of the door like liquid and trailing the small body behind, its slimy black tentacle still wrapped around the leg. Ida fell asleep holding the girl as they sat on the floor of the closet. The sunlight coming through the crack in the doors woke her, and she pushed them open. She could see the dust floating in the light as her eyes adjusted to the glow. Ida pulled herself out from under the girl, resting her head gently on the floor before standing into the bright morning. She walked through the floating dust and to the stairs. She ignored the mangled corpse of the preacher as she stepped slowly across the wooden floor. She climbed the winding stairs, her feet loud on the steps as she walked to the beacon. She came to the top of the stairs and went to the window. The light rotated behind her. The clockwork still spun the mirrors. She looked out to the sea. The day was clear and it was bright. The rocks on the cliffs had been exposed by low tide, and gulls called to each other as they searched for food. The black disc was gone. It had left silently as she slept in the closet with the girl. She could still feel the fear that she had been given. She extinguished the light and released the clockworks. The mirrors slowed their rotations before coming to a stop. She walked back down the stairs, back to the room and to the girl. Only one thought filled her mind as images of the terrible, tentacled beast came to her. It would be back. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to click subscribe and check out some more stories here.